All right, everybody. Are we recording? Are we rocking and rolling here?
Yep.
Okay. Hi, everybody. This is Harvey Sluggo Wasserman. We're here on Juneteenth for the 141st, count them, 141st Green Grassroots Emergency Election Protection Coalition call. We're going to start the hour with Dan Ellsberg, the great Dan Ellsberg. Going to have Norman Stockwell and other Dennis Bernstein and other folks who were closely affiliated with him, DOROTHY REIK, to talk about Dan Ellsberg. But it is Juneteenth, and we are honored with the presence of the great Ray McClendon, the political director of the Georgia NAACP. Hey, where can I get a shirt like that? I'm a 2X, Ray.
We got you.
I need that shirt. So you look like you're in a church. I know you've got an event. We want to trouble you, if you could, please, to give us kind of an invocation for Juneteenth before you run away.
Sure, absolutely. We take this time to celebrate and to honor Juneteenth because it truly is an American holiday. It represents freedom when America was living up to its creed that all men were created equal and have certain inalienable rights. So as we pause now to reflect, let's take a moment of devotion to the
Ray, are you good there? Is there anything we do? Am I the only one that can't hear Ray?
I can't hear him either. Ray, can you hear us?
There we go. Ray, back. There you go.
I hear you guys fine.
Yes. Okay, now we hear you. So just
okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. So as we take this time, this is truly an American celebration, as I was saying, because it's a time when America absolutely stood up to honor its creed that all men, indeed all men, not just white men with property, had certain inalienable rights. So we honor and celebrate, but we also must solemnly take this day as an opportunity that the fight is not over. So let's take a moment to reflect in meditation. To the creator of the universe, we thank you for this time to celebrate freedom, a freedom that came through justice, although deferred, was not denied. So we thank you for the words of the prophet Micah that says 3 things we must do to honor you. And that is that we would seek justice, that we would love kindness, and that we would walk humbly before you. So on this day, as we celebrate, we not only celebrate the history of this day, but we look to a future that brings justice to all, where love permeates throughout this great country, and that we will continue to walk humbly before you. So thank you for this day. And we say this in the name of all who honor you. And everyone said together, amen.
Amen. Thank you, Ray.
Alrighty.
Thank you so much.
My
we know
pleasure.
you got to run. We've been honored by your presence, and send me that T-shirt when you get a minute.
All right, I got you. 2X. I'll grab one for you.
Thank you, man.
All
Take
right.
care.
All righty. Thank you.
All right, we appreciate that. Thank you, Ray. For those for the historian and me, the root of Juneteenth, many of you probably know, it refers to June 19th, 1865. The war, the Civil War, ended at Appomattox on April 9th or thereabouts, and with the end of the war, essentially was the end of slavery. Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation officially on January 1st, 1863, but the war was still going on. And when the South finally surrendered, when Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox, it became official, but the word of the Union victory did not reach Galveston, Texas until June 19th, 1865. And at that point, it was clear that the slavery was over, and that the 13th Amendment, as ratified by the Congress during the war, would in fact work. And so that's why June 19th is recognized as the official end of slavery throughout the whole United States, because Galveston apparently was the last one to get the news. So we can all take pride, as Ray said, in June 19th. It is a federal holiday, amazingly enough, and so we can applaud that as well. Okay, we also now are going to devote much of this coming hour to the great Dan Ellsberg. After that, at 6 o'clock Eastern, 3 o'clock Pacific, we're going to talk about some nuclear issues and other issues in Ohio. And I see we're also joined by Antonio Gisbert, who we're going to talk to about something going on in Oregon, which I think we'll all find interesting. But I do want to start, as promised, with the great Dan Ellsberg. I had the honor, actually, of being arrested with Dan Ellsberg at the Pentagon in 1980. We had an affinity group that we marched into the antechamber there, at the Pentagon at the front door, and they held us all there. And our affinity group was Dr. Benjamin Spock, the baby doctor, and his cohort, Mary Morgan, and Dan Ellsberg, Dan Berrigan, and Susanna Styron. And we all got arrested, and they booked us, and then we went out to dinner. It was your ideal kind of arrest, and Dan was just a wonderful, wonderful guy. So we have a number of people who knew him and worked with him, who are with us to basically speak their piece about Dan. I wanted to start with Norman Stockwell, the publisher of the progressive.org, and then Dorothy Reik of the Santa Monica Democrats, and the Progressive Democrats, and then Dennis Bernstein, the host of the Flashpoints show. And Dan Ellsberg, I've been reading a lot of eulogies or obituaries for Dan. I mean, he was truly an amazing guy. I don't know if we've been joined. I asked Randy Keeler to join us. I don't know, Randy, if he is on, but among the things that I read, and then we'll go to Norm Stockwell, is that Dan Ellsberg, when he was kind of becoming radicalized, went and heard a speech by a draft resistor. And he was inspired by this draft resistor, and it led really to a lot of Dan Ellsberg's radicalization. And the name of the draft resistor was Randy Keeler, Kehler. And Randy Keeler is an old friend of mine. He lives in Western Massachusetts, and he went to prison for quite a while, rather than cooperate with anything having to do with the Vietnam War. And I hoped Randy might join us. I don't know if he will, but keep your eye out for Randy Keeler, if you would. Let's start now. Norm Stockwell, I know you worked with Dan Ellsberg. You knew a lot about him. Can you tell us your feelings about Dan, and then we'll go to Dorothy Reik.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Harvey, and thanks for the invite. It certainly was sad news, I guess not unexpected, since Dan had written to all of us and told us that it was coming, but it was still sad to see the news. And here at the Progressive Magazine, we have kind of a bookend relationship with the Pentagon Papers, because at the beginning of the decade of the 1970s was Dan Ellsberg's famous Pentagon Papers case, which made a great strike in favor of the freedom of the press. And at the other end of the decade was our own case at the Progressive Magazine, when the government preemptively attempted to keep us from publishing an article about the H-bomb, and we did get to publish that article. So we have a great affinity for that period of Dan Ellsberg's work. But you know, he has so much more in his life, and I just wanted to quote really quickly from three things that Dan Ellsberg had in the Progressive magazine during the 1980s and 1990s. In a 1989 interview, he said this really moving thing where he said, "Of course I get discouraged, but what this is about is preserving life on Earth, and life on Earth is marvelous, a miracle. Every moment that we can prolong life on Earth, that is worth anything that we can do." Later in an article that he wrote right around the time of the end of the Soviet Union, and he wrote, "It's misleading to describe the United States and the Soviet Union as having military-industrial complexes. They are military-industrial complexes. It's a defining characteristic that our economies, our research and development, and the mainsprings of our industrial base are centered on military spending. Our elite's short-run point of view has always been to sustain the addiction of our economy to military income, to keep that regular fix of military spending flowing through our veins." And then finally, one last quote. This was an article he wrote right at the beginning of the Persian Gulf War in 1991. And he wrote, "The truth is that the continuation and expansion of this war represent a graver danger and a greater evil than do any of the plausible diplomatic agreements to end it." And that's, you know, so much, so contemporary as well as historical. So Daniel Ellsberg will be greatly missed here at the Progressive magazine, and those quotes that I read and links to a bunch of his articles are available through a free weekly email newsletter that we do. I'll throw the address in the chat if people are interested in subscribing to it and getting stories like that and many more from the pages of the history of the Progressive magazine.
Well, the Progressive magazine is really a national treasure, as was Dan, and I know you had a symbiotic relationship with Dan, Norman, and your work in particular has been spectacular. So thank you for that link. I do want to jump in here and remind you, in particular, Norman, people in general, that we're now in the middle of an election for the Pacifica Radio National Board, and we will be talking for the local station boards. And we will be talking about that in great detail. Norm, I wanted to remind you to please post the link for joining Pacifica. We're asking everybody to join Pacifica. It's $25, and then you get to vote in the election. But Norm, I know you knew Dan, and you know, it's really great to have you on with us. And to the Progressive, I remember Erwin Knoll, your predecessor, by a few decades, and the whole Michigas with the Pentagon Papers, followed by the Progressive Papers, and it's a really major chapter in our history. And we'll go to Dorothy Reik in a minute, but I do want to mention that in the light of Dan Ellsberg's career, just before the beginning of this Zoom call, I read that we are like one step away from the potential extradition of Julian Assange. And, you know, if anybody has followed in the footsteps of Dan Ellsberg, it's Julian Assange. And we don't know what's going to be happening, but I guarantee you next week we will be talking in great detail. They could be days away from dragging Julian Assange to the United States. So God help him, God help us all. Norm, thank you so much. It's great to see you as always. And we'll have you.
Thank you. It's an honor to be part of this program and to remember an amazing person, Daniel Ellsberg.
Yes, really, absolutely. Thank you so much. We're going to go to Dorothy Reik in the Santa Monica Mountains here. Dorothy, you had a beautiful statement that you put out about Dan Ellsberg.
Want me just to read it?
You
Okay.
can do it. You can do
I would
whatever
rather
you
just
like.
read it because I get, you know, and I sent it, Alan sent this out and Howie Klein printed it and he said the same as I said, that when I was writing it, I cried. And when he said it, when he was reading it, he cried. So it's kind of a little personal. I didn't know him that well, but here we go. For those of us of a certain age, Daniel Ellsberg, like Tom Hayden, was a constant presence in our lives. From his release of the Pentagon Papers, the threat of life imprisonment, the dismissal of his case and his continuing opposition to war, he was always on our minds as we tried to free the world from war, prevent nuclear annihilation, and work towards a more just world. I first met him in person at Progressive Democrats of America National Confab in Cleveland. He was excited to hear I was from Topanga, one of his favorite haunts when he worked at RAND. Over the years, whenever things seemed too hard to bear, he would write an op-ed or show up on TV or the radio, usually on Democracy Now!, to remind us that there was goodness in the world, even as it seemed that evil was winning the day, imploring us never to give up. In spite of all he knew, it was obvious, at least to me, that he believed humanity would come to its senses and survive if we kept on working. Dan loved to talk. When PDSMM gave him our Lifetime Achievement Award, sadly on Zoom, our meeting ran way over time as we clung to every word and peppered him with questions for which he always had a thoughtful answer. The last time I saw him was on a PD America Sunday town hall. He was as loquacious as ever, making the best of his diagnosis by eating all the foods he had been denied for years and warning us yet again that nuclear war was a possibility and that even limited use of nukes would cause untold suffering and must be prevented at all costs. We could not believe he was even sick, let alone dying. His life force was still so strong. He is survived by his children and, of course, his wife, Patricia, whose anti-war efforts turned the creation of the war machine into a warrior for peace.
Wow. Dorothy, thank you so much for that. You want to say anything extemporaneously here?
You know, I didn't know him that well, but I think we all loved him. Even, you know, he just was part of our lives. He was always there. He was always in the ether. He was just part of the world we lived in. And I want to give another shout out to Patricia, because whatever we say about who turned him around, it was Patricia who took him to his first anti-war demonstration. And if it wasn't for Patricia, I don't know what would have happened. I don't know that Dan would have become a peace activist without her. So thank God for her, and we just loved him, and he was just there for us. Like I said, like Tom Hayden, like Harry Belafonte, like a lot of people, those of us of a certain age, took for granted that they would just be immortal, that they would always be there to guide us and to cheer us on and to make us feel that everything would eventually be all right. And now I don't know.
Yeah. You know, when I heard Dan had cancer and that he was going to pass, I didn't believe it. Frankly, I said, no, that can't happen. Dan Ellsberg can't die. But here we are. But, you know, there's so much to learn from his life. He was a wonderful, wonderful guy. Dennis Bernstein, are you with us, Dennis? Can I unmute you? Thank you so much, Dorothy. Greatly appreciated. Dennis, go ahead.
I think I'm unmuted, yes?
No, you're good. You're good.
I'm good. Okay, great. Well, I want to tell two quick stories. And my friends who are very close to Dan, my close friends, say he sort of went out like a star the way he came in. So I interviewed Dan right before we all closed down for the COVID. It was an interview, of course, on Assange, and you know, it's like, meet me at the station, Dan. And you know, he's in his 80s, and I'm thinking, okay, I'm coming over, and I'm thinking maybe we should have just done this on the phone. If he really wanted to come over, I'm thinking I'm gonna go out there and wait for him, help this old man get into the building. And I'm waiting outside there, and all of a sudden, he comes in his little sports car, some kind of uh, I don't remember the name of the sports car, but the hood's down and he just revs right into the parking lot. He says, oh, hops out of the car. He says, okay, I'm ready to go. Let's go. And I'm ready to help this old man. Anyway, he did a mighty powerful interview, which I will play tomorrow on Flashpoints about Assange. But I want to say one story. Nora Barrows Friedman, who does the Electronic Intifada, a very close friend of the Dan's family, and Dan was actually visiting Nora's mom, Anna Barrows, and Nora comes in the house and she just got her license. She had just got it in the mail. Finally, she was allowed to drive, and Dan had just bought a brand new car, this sports car. So Dan said, hey, you might as well take the car for a ride. So Dan had this day-old sports car, and Nora had her first ride on this car. And Nora's mom, of course, was terrified about what might happen with that new car. Anyway, I met Dan through my friend, Paul Berman. They both were exiles from Washington, both worked for Henry Kissinger. I met Dan through Paul, so I had a very close, I came in a very personal way. They were both crazy, and really they had both essentially tripped out of their I think Paul's job was to create those charts that told you how much damage a nuclear weapon did if you were 10 miles away, 20 miles away, 30 miles away. And, Dan was engaged in sort of, as we know, war making and all this kind of stuff. And they were amazing. They were committed to the work they were doing for the government. They were ready to sort of do the work that they thought was the right thing to defend against the dangers of the world. And they both were transformed by women and by knowledge and so my first program for Pacifica Radio was at a protest to close down Rocky Flats in Colorado. And I was all scheduled. I showed up there with a tape recorder I didn't even know how to use. And I was supposed to interview Dan Ellsberg and Allen Ginsberg. They were both at the Rocky Flats plant, planning to sit down and be arrested, stopping the nuclear train from coming into the, to create the trigger bombs that I guess they needed the atomic bomb to trigger the hydrogen bomb or something, whatever. They made the triggers there at Rocky Flats, and both Ginsberg and Ellsberg were there to resist. I remember I showed up, I actually took a taxi to Ellsberg's hotel, met him there, watched him get dressed. This is my first interview ever. We got in a taxi cab, we went over to Rocky Flats where we met Allen Ginsberg. We get out of the car, they're talking to each other. I'm recording all of this. And I turn to Allen Ginsberg and I say, Allen, what do you want to tell us to do? What are we going to be able to do to resist nuclear weapons, nuclear war? And Ginsberg looks at me, he looks at Dan Ellsberg, he says, I'm not going to do anything to resist anything. I'm going to make love to plutonium. I'm going to embrace it on the tracks. And, I didn't quite get it, but Dan was practically on the ground. And then I guess I was getting a quick lesson in Zen Buddhism from Dan Ellsberg and from Allen Ginsberg. Anyway, we made a documentary. It was called What's Really Happening at Rocky Flats. And it was the most extraordinary opportunity to begin my radio career. And I can't tell you how graceful Dan was, because he must have known it was my first interview. And, it was one of those things where somebody answers the questions you wish you asked about the and so that you end up with a beautiful interview no matter what stupid question you ask. And that's the nature of Dan Ellsberg and Allen Ginsberg. And Dan was a friend all the way through, always ready at the drop of a hat to talk with us, to share with us, to inform and expand our knowledge. And I must have interviewed him about 15 times, to the point where he said to me once, he says, you don't need an excuse every time to interview me. You can just call me up and ask me whatever you want. Anyway, thanks for giving me this chance to tell these
Well,
stories.
Thank you, Dennis. I guess you could say that you lost your virginity with Dan Ellsberg.
Can I say one other thing?
Of course, please.
The first interview that I did about the Pentagon Papers was when I came over to Dan's house with Paul, and there was a young woman there. And it turns out it was the woman who photocopied the Pentagon Papers. And she told me the most beautiful story about being in the copy mat and knowing she's like in the middle of changing history, and a couple of cops in uniforms walk by, and she's thinking to herself, can you imagine what kind of bust it would have been for these two young cops to see that there was somebody who was subverting U.S. foreign policy in the copy mat as they walked by. Anyway, I just thought that's a beautiful drama. And that was the first original piece I did on the Pentagon Papers, is like what it felt like to copy them.
Wow, fantastic. Thank you so much, Dennis. I've seen a documentary film about Dan. I don't remember the title of it. If anybody can recall the title, there's a full-on documentary about him, and I don't remember the name. It was very good, though. I'm going to go to Tatanka in a minute. I'm told someone is telling me, Peggy Thomas, did you want to say something? If you do, please raise your hand. And I will unmute you. I don't know if you have the possibility of doing it yourself, but let us know if you want to speak. Let me go now. Actually, Tatanka, Ruth was prior to you. Can we do Ruth and then Tatanka, please? Ruth Strauss, let's get you unmuted. Go ahead. Ruth Strauss.
Yeah, the documentary that you're talking about is just fantastic. And even before you said that, I raised my hand because I wanted to tell people. It's called The Most Dangerous Man in America. And it is fantastic. It's riveting. It's fun. It's political. It's historical. Everybody has got to watch it. You will be glad you did. Thanks.
Well, thank you. Okay, I got a quick quiz for you here. Richard Nixon actually called two men the most dangerous man in America. One of them was Dan Ellsberg. Who can tell me who the other one was? Does anybody know? It was Tim Leary. What a pair. Dan Ellsberg and Tim Leary, both referred to by Richard Nixon as the most dangerous man in America. And of course, he was right. So there you go. He was right both times, as a matter of fact. Okay, Tatanka, please go ahead. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you for that.
Yeah, we lost a miracle of a man. Mentioning Tim Leary, one of the conversations Dan and I had, maybe why he said that, was the effect that he thought that the woman who dropped acid with JFK, the effect it had on his life and on our history altogether, which that's another story. So I want to talk about a couple themes. One is the miracle of life, which he talked about. The other is the admonition, don't wait. And Dorothy is correct. I mean, Dan always, when he was asked to talk about Randy, he would always say there were two things. One was Randy Keeler, who we strongly identified with from, Harvard on into the military and all that, and taking his active conscience with War Resisters League. And the other was Patricia. So it was hand in hand, living with a woman who was protesting against the war. Dan used every opportunity to say, don't do what I did. Don't wait years before millions others die. He had to live with that his whole life. He brought it up until 6 weeks. I had my last conversation with him was, I'll treasure it. I didn't know it was going to be the last, but about 45 minutes. It happened to be 2 days before the doctor gave him that 1-month diagnosis. And he didn't want to get off the phone. He was just so full of enthusiasm and said, have you up to Kensington, Patricia and I want to have you for dinner. It's been too long. We'll spend a whole afternoon and evening. And then, it was time for him to go. At my wedding with Joy Marcus in 1979 at the Bach Dancing Dynamite Society out on the coast in Half Moon Bay, he was, one of our dear friends who gave this incredible speech holding up Michael was probably, I don't know, just months old. I don't even think 3 months. And he held him up and he talked about the miracle of birth together with the miracle that we're even here and all the miracles it took, all the people we now know that saved us from nuclear annihilation. He was always, as people mentioned, ready to answer questions and explore. His curiosity and his exploration was just endless. He also shared with me, the date he was going to come forward with all the stuff he had that he hadn't been revealed since the Pentagon Papers and since, a few years ago when he came out again and risked decades more time in jail. He said, I can't sit on this stuff anymore. And he would be the first to say, don't just see my film. The producer of that film, the award-winning film, also produced The Boys Who Said No, which is the story of the Vietnam draft resistance. And we spent a couple of days together with about 50 of us at David Harris's home and then over in San Francisco to film that. And so The Boys Who Said No, and for those of you that are too young or don't remember, that name comes from the iconic poster. World War II used to have the Jane Mansfield posters and stuff of GIs, Well, we had the poster of the three Baez sisters, sitting on I think a rock wall in Carmel with the skirt, legs crossed, just skirt up prudently above their knees. And on the top, it says, girls say yes to boys who say no. So that's what it's in reference to. And then also the follow-up film that came out called The Movement and the Madman, about the effect that the anti-war movement did have on that demonstration in front of the White House when Nixon and Kissinger were talking about nuking North Vietnam very, very casually. And Kissinger, no, I don't think so. I'm president. Too many people, we wait. And then Watergate happened and we were spared at that time. So he was, I was able to take him out to his first, he wanted to experience a strike. And I took him out with Joan Baez out to a strike in Fresno, probably 74, 75. And he was out there on the strike and he spoke about way too long, which he would love to do, but everybody loved it, and talked about RFK and his love of the movement and his relationship with Dolores Huerta. Used to hang out with him at Stinson Beach. They had a place out there. And one time I went out and kind of went into a trance beyond the waves. And I was out there 2.5 hours and came in and they were all freaked out that I was gone. That led to an interesting conversation about life after death. Anyway, and his commitment to Pacifica was huge as well. So thank you for the time. We will miss you, Daniel. And his word to potential whistleblowers is don't wait and don't expect the miracle that I had, because things are so much worse for whistleblowers now. Thank you.
Right. And Dan, actually, I quote him in my history book. He said something that was truly astounding. He was, prior to being a whistleblower, he was a very, very high level, Pentagon think guy. Yeah. And he met with Nixon in the Oval Office. And Nixon was musing with Dan Ellsberg about using nuclear weapons in Vietnam. Mm-hmm. And Nixon really wanted to use nuclear weapons in Vietnam, but he told Dan Ellsberg that the country would go nuts and the students would tear the place apart. And so it really verified the incredibly important role that the anti-war movement played.
And the role,
like to say, oh, we didn't have an impact. Here's Dan Ellsberg confirming that the movement against the war in Vietnam prevented Richard Nixon
Yes.
from using nuclear weapons in
It,
Vietnam.
it did have an impact, definitely. And he also, the role, which isn't written about much, he knew that one bit of confrontation and that tension around the bridge in Berlin, if there had been one shot fired, it would have been on the ground. It was all set up for nuclear war to happen. There was no hotline. So he lobbied for years behind the scenes, even before the Pentagon Papers, to have a hotline between the president of the United States and the president of the Soviet Union to prevent World War III, to at least have a conversation. That was Dan's work as well.
Amazing stuff. Thank you for that, Tatanka. David Schlesinger, Jeffrey quickly, and then Eric Lazarus.
Thanks so much. Yes, I met Dan several times. I'm certainly regret his passing. And one of the more recent times I met him, he shared with me that his best friend was Professor Peter Dale Scott.
Oh,
of
yeah, I
Berkeley.
met him.
And Peter Dale Scott is the person who coined the term deep state.
Ah, amazing. Yes, I met Peter with Dan. He was quite a brilliant guy, of course. Jeffrey, very quickly, and then Eric. Anyone else wants to speak? Please raise your hand now, because we're gonna move on. But we want to let everybody who wants to say a word, please do. Go ahead, Jeffrey, please.
Or two things involving Daniel Ellsberg. One, because we must remember that because of what the Pentagon leak papers, it eventually led to the Watergate scandal and eventually Richard Nixon's resignation or almost impeachment. And secondly, due to all that you said, now I kind of wish I actually met him in person before he died.
He was a very, very good guy. You know, a lot of people who are famous or do things aren't such great people and aren't fun to be with. But Dan was a wonderful guy. And when you see the movie, The Most Dangerous Man in America, you'll see the role that Patricia played. It was very central. I don't remember The Most Dangerous Man in America talking about Randy Keeler. That I must say, I knew Randy Keeler very, very well. And Randy paid a very heavy price for his resistance. He was in prison for quite a while, and it caused him tremendous physical hardship. As many people who went through the prison experience, Randy really had a lot of back pain and many other things he paid for. But when I read, and I didn't know this until I was reading the obits after knowing Randy for decades, that Randy inspired Dan in many ways. It really confirmed that syndrome a lot of us know as organizers of, you go around the country and you give speeches and, there's 3 or 4 people sometimes, and you never know if it's just a big waste of time. And here Randy, who gave many, many speeches, happens to give a speech that inspires, of all people, Dan Ellsberg. I mean, so it's just like, I had a conversation once with Jeremy Rifkin, and we were talking, and this really applies. We were talking about all the times we went all across the country and spoke to like 2 people, and Jeremy said this amazing thing. He said, when you show up, no matter how many people there, even if it's 1 or 2 or 3, you got to give the whole speech, because one of them might be a Gandhi. And in this case, it was Dan Ellsberg. I later heard, by the way, that that speech was that phrase was not original to Jeremy Rifkin. In fact, there's a piece in Bertrand Russell's autobiography, Bertrand Russell, the great peace activist, and he once called a mass rally for peace in Trafalgar Square in the heart of London. And 1 person showed up, but it was Gandhi. So there you go. So, Randy Keeler, all those speeches you gave, all the time you spent in prison, all the pain you suffered, Here's Dan Ellsberg to speak for it. Eric Lazarus, and then
Yeah,
Vinny.
just very briefly, just had a few minutes with Dan Ellsberg right before the war on Iraq began. He gave a lovely talk in an auditorium in Manhattan, and a small group of like 6 people hung out with him afterwards. And the topic was like, how did he know there were no weapons of mass destruction? And he was very generous and spent time with us and explained how lying and the Pentagon works. And so I kind of knew that we'd never find weapons of mass destruction because I had a little bit of time with Dan Ellsberg. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Very good. Much appreciated. Vinny DiStefano, let's get you unmuted. Go ahead.
You betcha. Hey, the very first seminar we put on at the UCLA School of Law for Assange defense in 2019, Daniel was a huge part of that event, along with Noam Chomsky and a lot of other speakers. And although I was a lowly speaker in the event, I felt proud just to share the stage with him. I'll show you a very brief, funny story. I was coming back from Guatemala one time. My wife and I are on vacation, and she worked for United Airlines, so we were flying on her ticket, which meant we were separated. And I was sitting next to a woman who had her nose buried in a book, and I had my nose buried in a book. And when our meals came, we started talking. We started talking about Latin America. And it turned out she'd just come back from Nicaragua. Although she was an American, she was serving in the Sandinista government. And as we began to talk about Latin America, she says, you know a bit more about Latin America than the average American. How do you know so much? I said, well, I read everything I can get my hands on. She goes, what have you read that's very good lately? I said, well, I don't know whether you know this guy or not, but Daniel Ellsberg just released his book, Secrets, about the Pentagon Papers. And I said, if I was going to read anything, that is the book I would pick up. And she laughed. She goes, so you're the one. I said, what do you mean? I'm the one. She says, nobody read that goddamn book. And I said, how do you know? She said, because Daniel Ellsberg is my father. It was Mary Ellsberg.
Whoa.
And it's the closest I ever got to him, other than the night that he made his release of information that he was dying of pancreatic cancer. We were doing a screening of the movie Ithaca, and I got to tell you, it was a gut punch to me. In a world full of idols with feet of sand, there was a man made out of utter granite. His like will not pass our way again. I cried when I heard that he died.
Well, maybe he didn't.
Yeah, he's living in Florida with all the other people, with Jimmy Hoffa and JFK.
He's hanging out with Joe Hill.
Yeah, yes, he is. He is.
Ron Leonard. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that I thought Daniel was not only a hero to me, he was a hero to a generation, and that generation can transfer what we learned from Dan, which was to fight the righteous fight is the greatest joy in your life. And we all learned that by listening to him. I got to thank him a couple of times for what he did, but that experience will transfer through us who saw him and knew him in the day to every generation going forward, because this is the joy we can transfer forward.
Very well said. Thank you, Ron. Thank you so much. And Wendy Lederman, go ahead, and then Steve.
Thank you. I'll just kind of segue from that. I guess I just kind of wanted to throw my word in, coming from the generation. Like I think I was born the year that you got arrested with him in 1980.
Right.
But I'm 42 now, and just the last like 10, 15 years, like since I became even more, like I've always been pretty radical, but really, really delving in with my education on the way that the system truly works. And obviously Daniel Ellsberg is one of the first stories I came across, and just left such an incredible imprint on me. So I think this is kind of directed at Dorothy a little bit too, in her beautiful speech, just letting you know that his presence that you were talking about, like granted, I never met him. I wasn't there when the things happened, but once I learned about him, read quotes and interviews, and just really getting to familiarize with his story and witnessing everything that's followed. Like, he really truly has made an impact on the ones that weren't even there in a very, very deep way. And so I just wanted to thank everybody for your beautiful tributes, and just know that, you know, its energy doesn't, it just changes form. And so we're all gonna take those qualities that we admire and appreciate and try to live them for him and keep the fight going. As they say, don't mourn, organize. But anyway, I love you guys. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you so much. Steve Kaiser, if anyone else wants to speak, raise your hand now. I see Joel Simpson. But we're almost to the end of our time with him. Steve Kaiser, then Joel Simpson, and Anna Georgie in Western Mass.
I just want to mention.
Go ahead, Steve.
I just want to mention that Daniel Ellsberg was a big ufologist. He's appeared at, studying of UFOs. He appeared at our local MUFON group and UFARs, speaking on UFOs. And he said he became aware of and interested in UFOs when he was a teenager. And it was like his first step into thinking that things were different than what they were being represented to be. And I was really looking forward to hearing him talk today about that, because he bridges an important gap between social activists and people really looking at what's happening in the world and drawing the connection that there's a lot of things being represented in a way that is totally false. So anyway, he was a great ufologist too, and to say the least, we'll miss him endlessly. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you very much. Joel Simpson, and then Anna Georgie. Joel, let me get you on. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks for doing this. You know, I was at an anti-war rally in front of the federal courthouse in New York, and there he was in the crowd. And for some reason, he and I just got close to each other, and he bent down and told me some inside information, and I can't even remember what it was, but he was so friendly and so open. I was so touched by being addressed by this great man. And I don't even know if this is significant enough a story, but he spoke. I had seen him many times before at the Left Forum and photographed him, but that was thrilling to hear the voice, the unmistakable voice of Daniel Ellsberg in my ear. And I just wanted to say goodbye to him publicly and thank you for doing this.
Well, I assume you haven't washed your ears since, so.
That's right. That's why the right ear is very full of wax, and it keeps getting in my hearing aid. But
yeah, Dan was very approachable, very human, and it was great to know him. And he was he really gave good arrest. I mean, it was good getting arrested with Dan. Anna Georgie, please. Anna from Western Mass, a good close friend of Randy Keeler's, of course.
Yeah. And I'm sure he'll hear about this. I just want to put in 2 cents from Western Mass, and that is that happily, along with your archive, Sluggo, Daniel Ellsberg 500 box archive is at the wonderful Social Concerns archive at the University of Massachusetts. And I've put the link in the box in the chat, because they are digitalizing material. They've had a whole year of forum with Randy and others speaking about Daniel Ellsberg's work. So just to spread the word, I just wanted to put out that this is an incredible resource direct from Daniel Ellsberg himself.
Well, Anna is very much responsible in many ways for that archive. She worked with the great Rob Cox, who unfortunately left us, and my papers are there with Dan Ellsberg's and W.E.B. Du Bois, and there are a few others notables, but it's a great thing, Anna. Thank you so much for mentioning that. And you can see a lot of, they are diligently scanning stuff, and you can see a lot of Dan's stuff online, which is really, really amazing. Thank you. I hadn't thought of that.
Thank you.
John Steiner and then Dennis. Thank you, Anna.
Yeah,
and give our love, please, to Randy Keeler. and make sure that he knows that he was greatly mentioned for all he's done over the years. Dennis Bernstein again, go ahead. Oh no, John Steiner was next. John Steiner and then Dennis.
Harvey, thank you for doing this and for everyone who's spoken. Joel wanting to follow. He was one of those people that so many of us were privileged to know. And he made himself available, and he always seemed to have enough time, almost wanting to stop the conversation, keep the conversation going when you were ready to stop it. And I don't have any idea how he was able to do that in his life, plus everything else he did. But I want to tell one story. I'd gotten to know Dan and Pat over the years, both personally and professionally. And we found ourselves on a plane ride to DC one day from the Bay Area. And he told me personally the story of how his mother and sister had been killed in that car crash when he was riding in the seat behind his father. And it was as if he was given another life that he didn't know, that didn't belong to him anymore. And I think it gave him a direction that ended up leading to part of who he was and what he did. Because he, as we all know, he was utterly fearless. And it was as if death had already happened to him. And there was another life he was living that had been almost given by grace. And it was such a gift to hear him tell that story personally and to feel it. And then to get an even deeper sense of what he brought to us all these years and what will live on.
Yeah, that's an amazing thing, John. Thank you for bringing that into the mix. Mind-boggling. Thank you for that. Dennis Bernstein again. Dennis? Are you unmuted? No, wait, hold on. There you go. Well, there. No? Go ahead, Dennis.
Got it. I just want to say, I mentioned that I had a chance to really meet Dan because my good friend Paul Berman, they were sort of Kissinger colleagues, having escaped the insanity. And I want to say this based on my personal knowledge of, what happened in the last months and days and stuff. I can assure everybody that Dan went out of this world the same way that he came in, exalted and tripping on every little thing in life, being totally alive. These are the kind of, Dan and Paul, these kind of, you go to the movies and maybe somebody'd smoke a joint or something, and you're on the way to the movies and there would be like a beautiful tree or something. And one of them would pull over, and say, look at, they'd be halfway in the middle of the road, you know what I'm saying? And both of them were admiring a tree. We're in the road here, we got to, you know what I'm trying to say? So what I'm going to do here right now is I'm going to burn one for Dan and Patricia and the extraordinary. I love that Dan, you all must have heard that he had given up salt and then he started eating salt again. Did you hear this? That he was going to do all the things he had to give up to, keep going. He started doing them. Boy, did he love salt. He had a huge chocolate cake somewhere in the last few days. So this is for you, Dan and Patricia, coming out of Berkeley. It's homegrown something.
All right. Well, thank you, Dan. Thank you, Dennis, for
Dennis,
that.
yes.
And if we had
Thank you.
better technology, we could all get stoned on that one joint, but I don't think
There you
it'll
go.
pass
Doing
through.
my best.
Okay. Does anyone else want to chime in here? We're almost at the top of the hour. We just want to just say, Dan, we love you. You changed the world for the better. You inspired all these great people. We got 57 people on the line, and not enough can be said for you. And someday up there, you and Tim Leary are jointly the most dangerous men in whatever. What an honor. All right, you guys. And thank you, Dan Ellsberg. Thank you, everybody, for joining in. This will be on Progressive Radio Network and, of course, archived at the Election Protection Zoom website. All right. Oh, I hate to say it, but let's move on. As we say, we've had with us Antonio Gisbert. Oh, and I want to say one thing, by the way. We may again be on the brink with Julian Assange, and I would not be surprised if Vinny DiStefano next week, Wendy, we wind up talking about Julian, and I don't know if these people have the guts to bring him here, for God's sakes. But, that's what they're talking about doing, so we'll see what happens. If I was Joe Biden, I'd put him on an airplane, tell everybody they're shipping him to America, and instead send him to Australia and let him go home, for God's sakes, All right, Dan Ellsberg, again, farewell, and we will see you in our dreams. Thanks to Wendy. Now we have Antonio Gisbert on with us from Oregon, and then we're going to go to Pat Morita in Ohio. But Antonio, you have a major thing coming up in Oregon. Can you tell us about it, please?
Yeah, thank you very much, everybody. My name is Antonio Gisbert, and my pronouns are he, him, and I am the chief petitioner of the Oregon Rebate. It's a ballot initiative that we are in the process of qualifying for the November 2024 election.
Okay, Antonio, can you talk a little louder and a little slower? Thank you.
Yes, sorry. My name is Antonio Gisbert, he, him are my pronouns. I am the chief petitioner of the Oregon Rebate, and that is a ballot initiative that we're working on qualifying in Oregon for the November 2024 election. Before all else, I have to express my gratitude for this invitation. Thank you, Wendy, and everybody else for having me here. I feel like I'm a little bit out of place because the project that I'm working on seems so small in comparison. But thank you for
no. Remember, that's the point. Randy Keeler, who was walking around the country speaking to very small groups, spoke to Dan Ellsberg. So there's one of us might be a Gandhi. In fact, the odds are pretty high, actually. So go ahead, please. Tell us what you got.
Yes, and that's why. How much time do I have, by the way?
Just a couple of minutes, if you would, just to explain what's going on there. We'll have you back, but the important thing is to break the ice and let us know what's going on. Just a couple minutes would be great.
Yeah, so real quickly, table setting, 3 core values that motivate the Oregon Rebate Ballot Initiative campaign. Number 1 is the value of direct democracy. I am sure you all know about this, but about half the states in America, we have the right people have the right to get together, draft a law, and if we collect enough signatures, that law appears on the general election ballot to be voted directly by the voters. That is what we did by convening a diverse group of friends in bars and coffee shops in rural Oregon, and over 8 months, using a consensus-driven process, we managed to draft something to touch on 2 other values. One being that of corporate tax justice. In Oregon, big corporations like Comcast pay less than 1/8 of 1% in taxes to the state. We all thought that was wrong, morally wrong. And so we thought that we should write a law to change that and increase that to 3%. And the second value is one of economic justice. We all feel that it is ever harder to make ends meet. This has been written about in many different ways. The hollowing out of the middle class is something that's very common. And so what we came up with is an idea to increase corporate taxes for the biggest corporations that do business in the state of Oregon and use that money to provide a direct cash transfer, we call it a rebate, to every Oregonian.